Only 27 more people needed to reach 1,000. If you're watching this, you might be the one who completes the milestone. Let's begin. In the smoky pubs of South London during the 1960s, when someone mentioned the Richardson name, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Men who'd fought in the war, who'd seen things that would haunt them forever, would suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. Because everyone knew you didn't cross the Richardsons. You didn't even want to be in the same room when their name came up. Picture South London in 1934, not the tourist postcards or the grand buildings, but the real South London Camberwell, with its narrow streets, crowded tenements, and the constant struggle of working-class life. Charlie Richardson was born here on January 18, 1934, in Brentford, Middlesex, to Eileen Elizabeth Mary and Charles Frederick Richardson, who had married the previous year in Camberwell. The family soon moved back to Camberwell, where younger brother Edward, known as Eddie, was born on January 21, 1936, followed by their youngest sibling, Elaine, born in 1940. The family lived first at Wren Road in Camberwell, then moved to a flat in Windham Road when the Second World War broke out. This wasn't the London of wealth and privilege. This was the London where fathers disappeared into pubs and sometimes never came home, where mothers counted pennies to feed their children, where boys learned to fight before they learned to read properly. Their mother ran a sweet shop in southeast London, while their father was a prize fighter and rag-and-bone man who would eventually abandon the family, leaving them penniless. Imagine being a young boy, watching your mother struggle to keep food on the table, watching her count the day's meager earnings from the sweet shop, knowing your father just walked away from it all. That kind of abandonment leaves a mark. It teaches you that the world is cruel, that you can only rely on yourself, and that if you want something, you'd better be prepared to take it. Charlie and Eddie endured a wartime childhood, enjoyed the vibrant street life of working-class London, and developed as talented young boxers and prominent street fighters. During the war years, while bombs fell on London and children were evacuated to the countryside, the Richardson boys stayed. They learned to navigate the chaos, the black market, the opportunities that arise when normal rules don't apply anymore. The brothers were known as wild and tough, who liked to box and cause trouble. Think about what London was like during and after the war. Buildings reduced to rubble, families torn apart, a whole generation of men damaged by what they'd seen and done. And in this chaos, two young brothers were learning that strength meant survival, that fear was a currency more valuable than pounds and shillings. They weren't just growing up, they were evolving, adapting to a world where violence wasn't just accepted, it was respected. By the time Charlie reached his early 20s, he wasn't just another tough guy from South London. He was a canny businessman who owned 6 scrap yards by the age of 22. He and Eddie had a penchant for hard work and made good money from the post-war scrap metal trade, plundering the remnants of abandoned wartime airfields. Picture them, these young men in their worn clothes and calloused hands, pulling apart the skeletons of war machines, turning destruction into profit. It was almost poetic in its way, making money from the remnants of violence, but scrap metal was just the beginning. Charlie invested in scrap metal, whilst Eddie operated fruit machines. These businesses were fronts for underworld activities which included fraud, racketeering, usury, theft, and stolen goods. It's important to understand they weren't playing at being businessmen. They were smart, calculating, and understood that legitimate business could hide illegitimate activities. Eddie would on occasion suggest that a pub landlord should buy one of his slot devices. Failure to do so meant running the risk of being beaten and the pub vandalized. Imagine being a pub landlord trying to make an honest living when Eddie Richardson walks through your door. He's all smiles at first, talking about business opportunities, about how his machines could increase your profits. But behind that smile, you can see something else. You know what happens to people who say no to the Richardsons. The brothers had an interesting dynamic. Charlie was the thinker, the planner, the one who saw the bigger picture. Eddie was more hands-on, more willing to get his hands dirty. Together, they were building something that South London had never seen before, an organized criminal empire that operated like a business, with structure, hierarchy, and most importantly, consequences for those who crossed them. Charlie Richardson had first encountered the Cray twins in Shepton Mallet Military Prison, where all were awaiting a dishonorable discharge from national service. This is crucial to understand. Both the Richardsons and the Crays had been in the military, had been trained to fight, to follow orders, to work as a unit. But they'd also learned they didn't fit into that world of rules and regulations. They were too wild, too independent, too willing to challenge authority. By the late 1950s, the Richardson gang wasn't just another group of thugs. By the end of the 1950s, the Richardsons had an empire in South London and an unrivaled team of hard men, including Jimmy Moody, George Cornell, and Mad Frankie Fraser. Let's talk about George Cornell for a moment. He was an important member of the Richardson gang. Cornell was heavily involved in drug dealing, in Purple Hearts and Dexies, uppers, downers, and cannabis. He wasn't just muscle, he was a earner, someone who understood that crime was evolving, that drugs were the future. But it was Frankie Fraser who would become the most notorious member of their crew. Frankie Fraser teamed up with the Richardson gang in the early 1960s. He was a known associate of gangster Billy Hill throughout the 1950s. After joining the Richardsons, he served as their enforcer. When people talk about Mad Frankie Fraser, they lower their voices even now, decades later. Frankie had a fearful reputation as a henchman. According to Eddie, his reputation was unwarranted and mainly owed to time Frankie served in Broadmoor, the high-security psychiatric hospital. When Frankie joined the Richardson gang, it was described by a rival as akin to China getting the atom bomb. He was ruthless, and nobody was likely to cross the gang with Frankie there. The Richardsons operated differently from other gangs. They weren't content with small-time protection rackets or petty theft. They thought bigger. They understood that real power came from fear, and fear came from reputation, and their reputation was about to become legendary for all the wrong reasons. Also known as the Torture Gang, they had a reputation as some of London's most sadistic gangsters. This wasn't a name they gave themselves, this was what other criminals called them. When hardened villains, men who'd spent their lives in violence, give you a nickname like that, it means something. The stories that emerged about their methods were the stuff of nightmares. But we need to be clear here, while maintaining respect for the victims and avoiding graphic details, these weren't just stories. These were testimonies given in court under oath by men who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out. The gang operated from various locations, but their base was in South London. It is alleged that a lot of local houses were built with Richardson gang money, all cash in hand, and then sold legitimately, thereby laundering the gang's ill-gotten gains. They were ahead of their time in many ways, understanding money laundering, property development, the importance of appearing legitimate while operating in the shadows. At one time, Charlie Richardson was arrested for receiving stolen goods, but was acquitted through lack of evidence and allegedly with the help of a large donation to the police fund. It was later revealed that many officers of the Metropolitan Police Force had taken bribes from the Richardson gang and other London gangsters. During that time, Scotland Yard was institutionally corrupt, and Charlie would often boast that he had a number of coppers in his pocket and that he would be told immediately when someone had gone to the police and grassed him up. This is crucial to understanding how they operated for so long. The police force in the 1960s wasn't what it is today. By 1966, the Metropolitan Police was allegedly so corrupt that the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, was considering replacing up to 70% of the CID. Imagine that 7 out of every 10 detectives potentially on the take. The Richardsons weren't just fighting the law, they'd bought it. The relationship between the Richardsons and the Krays is one of the most misunderstood aspects of London's criminal history. The Richardson gang and the Kray twins were engaged in a turf war in the mid to late 1960s, but this wasn't the all-out war that films and books would have you believe. If you were to believe local folklore, you would assume the two gangs had gun-toting, Jesse James-type wars, both spraying bullets like swarms of locusts across London. But in reality, the two tried to avoid each other. The Krays went out looking for the headlines, and the Richardsons went looking for money. The tensions that did exist were real, though. Tensions came to a head in 1965-66. During a Christmas party at the Astor Club in December 1965, Cornell called Ronnie Kray a fat poof, and a fight ensued. This wasn't just an insult in that world in that time, it was a declaration of war. George Cornell had essentially told Ronnie Kray that he didn't respect him, didn't fear him. In the criminal underworld of 1960s London, that was like signing your own death warrant. Everything changed on the night of March 7, 1966. On 7 or 8 March 1966, Richard Hart, one of the Kray's associates, was shot dead, intentionally or otherwise, during a brawl involving the Richardson gang at Mr. Smith's club in Rushy Green, Catford. This is where the mythology meets reality. Mr. Smith's wasn't just any club. Mr. Smith's was owned by Manchester-based businessmen Doogie Flood and Bill Benny. They had asked Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser to protect the club in exchange for gaming machines being placed there. That night, members of the Richardson gang were drinking at Mr. Smith's. What happened next would become one of the most infamous nights in British criminal history. Different people tell different versions of the story, but the facts are these. There was a confrontation, guns were drawn, and when the smoke cleared, people were dead and wounded. Let me paint you a picture of that night. The club is packed, music playing, drinks flowing. The Richardson crew is there: Eddie, Frankie Fraser, and others. Another South London gang arrives. On the night in question, both gangs were drinking and chatting quite happily. That was according to a guest who was with his girlfriend in the bar but was suddenly ushered out of the club soon after midnight. At around 1 a.m., Eddie Richardson told Peter Hennessy and the others to drink up and leave. In response, Hennessy called Eddie Richardson a half-baked fucking ponce and shouted that he could take you any fucking time you like. Richardson and Hennessy began exchanging blows. Other fistfights had started when gunshots rang out. Several years after the incident, an unnamed gangster who was in the club at the time said that it was like Dodge City. When the dust settled, Richard Hart was dead, and Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser were among the wounded. Eddie Richardson and Frank Fraser were arrested, Fraser for murder. Eddie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and others ended up in Lewisham Hospital. The next night, in what many saw as direct retaliation, Ronnie Cray murdered George Cornell. Cornell had made the fatal mistake of drinking in the Blind Beggar pub in Waitekapel Cray territory. Ronnie walked up to Cornell, and shot him in the head in front of a pub full of witnesses. Yet when police arrived, nobody had seen anything. The authorities had finally had enough. Under MacArthur's leadership, the Hertfordshire Force was investigating the Richardsons because the Home Office could not trust the Metropolitan Police, many of whom were in the pay of the Richardsons and other London gangs. They brought in clean cops from outside London, officers who hadn't been corrupted, who couldn't be bought. In July 1966, police arrested the remaining members of the Richardson gang following a series of raids in South London. At dawn on 30 July 1966, the memorable day that England beat Germany in the World Cup, 70 police officers raided homes across London's southeast. They seized the gang leader, Charlie Richardson, in bed. While England celebrated its greatest sporting triumph, the Richardson Empire was crumbling. Famously arrested on the day England won the World Cup in 1966, Charlie Richardson was arrested for torture on 30 July 1966, the World Cup final day. There's something almost cinematic about it, the entire country celebrating, while one of its most feared criminals is dragged from his bed in handcuffs. Eddie Richardson was sent to prison for 5 years for a fray. But this was just the beginning. The authorities were building a bigger case, gathering witnesses, offering deals to those willing to testify. They were preparing for what would become one of the most sensational trials in British criminal history. Accurately dubbed as to allegations, the torture trial convened at the Old Bailey at the beginning of April 1967. The name alone tells you everything you need to know about what was about to be revealed. This wasn't going to be a typical criminal trial. This was going to expose a level of organized brutality that the British public had never imagined existed in their own country. Finding witnesses willing to testify was nearly impossible at first. The fear the Richardsons had instilled ran deep. Men who'd been victimized would rather go to prison themselves than testify against Charlie and Eddie. But eventually deals were made, protection was offered, and slowly people began to talk. A member of the Richardson gang, Johnny Bradbury, turned Queen's evidence. Bradbury was convicted of murdering a business associate named Waldeck in South Africa, allegedly on orders from Charlie Richardson. When sentenced to hang, Bradbury offered to inform on the Richardson gang in exchange for a pardon and immunity. Imagine being Charlie Richardson, sitting in your cell, learning that one of your own men, someone you trusted with your darkest secrets, has decided to save his own neck by destroying yours. The trial itself was extraordinary. At the trial in 1967, which became known as the torture trial, the jury heard evidence of sadistic brutality rarely heard in an English court. For weeks, the British public read newspaper accounts of violence that seemed to belong more to medieval times than modern London. The prosecution painted a picture of a gang that had turned violence into an art form, that had systematic methods for dealing with those who crossed them. The court detailed how Charlie Richardson used iron bars, pliers, and electrodes on opponents. He was accused of fraud, extortion, assault, and GBH. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was the testimony of the victims that really sealed their fate. Men stood up in court and described what had been done to them, the fear they'd lived with, the price of crossing the Richardsons. In the dock sat gang leader Charlie Richardson, his younger brother Eddie, and their notoriously violent enforcer, Frank Fraser, already known as Mad Frankie. Petty fraudster Benny Cowlston claimed he was tortured in Charlie Richardson's office and that Frankie Fraser tore his teeth out with pliers. The prosecution, led by Sebag Shaw QC, didn't mince words. The prosecutor told the jury that the case was about violence, not sudden violence committed on the spur of the moment, but brutal violence, systematically carried out with utter and callous ruthlessness. This wasn't crime of passion or opportunity. This was organized, methodical, calculated terror. The Richardsons were found guilty of fraud, extortion, assault, and grievous bodily harm. Charlie Richardson was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and Eddie had 10 years added to his existing sentence. 25 years, in 1967, that was one of the longest sentences ever handed down for crimes that didn't involve murder. The judge was sending a message: the era of organized crime ruling London streets was over. But even in defeat, Charlie Richardson wasn't finished. In 1980, after many attempts to obtain release, Charlie Richardson escaped from an open prison. He went on the trot for almost a year, even dressing as Santa Claus and giving out presents to children to publicize his requests for release. There's something almost tragically comic about it: one of London's most feared gangsters, dressed as Father Christmas, handing out toys while on the run from the law. The escape couldn't last forever, though. He was arrested with 5 other men in Earl's Court on suspicion of possession of drugs, having just been seen coming out of a sex shop which was known to be controlled by the Richardson family. His identity only came to light once arrested and in police custody in Kensington, when his probation officer contacted the police, having been informed by other gang members that he had been arrested. Charlie Richardson was not freed until July 1984. He'd served 17 years of his 25-year sentence. Eddie, meanwhile, had been released earlier but would face his own troubles. In 1990, Eddie Richardson was sentenced to 35 years after being convicted of involvement in a £70 million cocaine and cannabis heist. He was originally sentenced to 35 years but was released after 12, bringing his total number of years served to 23. The relationship between the brothers deteriorated dramatically during these years. The brothers fell out badly after Eddie accused Charlie of fraudulent business deals during Eddie's time in prison. Imagine that, after everything they'd been through together, after building an empire on loyalty and fear, they couldn't even maintain loyalty to each other. Looking back now, decades later, what strikes you most about the Richardson story isn't the violence or the crime, it's the waste. These were intelligent, capable men who could have been successful in legitimate business. Charlie especially had a brilliant mind for organization and strategy, but they chose a different path, and that path led to decades in prison, broken relationships, and a legacy of fear rather than respect. Eddie Richardson and his brother Charlie became infamous for their criminal activities in South London in the 1960s and 70s. Eddie served 23 years in prison. Eddie learned to paint during his second stretch and turned his life around. There's redemption in that, perhaps, the idea that even someone who'd been part of such darkness could find something creative, something positive, even behind bars. The Richardson gang's influence extended far beyond their actual crimes. They changed how organized crime operated in London. They showed that criminal enterprises could be run like businesses, with structure and planning. They demonstrated the power of reputation, how fear could be more valuable than any amount of money. But they also showed the ultimate futility of that life. No matter how feared you are, no matter how much power you accumulate, it can all come crashing down in a single police raid. The London they operated in no longer exists. The old neighborhoods have been gentrified. The pubs where deals were made have become gastropubs or coffee shops. There are pictures of the Richardson gang in the White Horse pub, now a community-run venture in Upton, Norfolk. The gang chose this as their rural bolt hole whenever they were under investigation in London. Even their hideaways have become part of community history, curiosities from a darker time. As the 1960s drew to a close, the era of the old-school London gangster was ending. The Richardsons were in prison, the craze would soon follow, and a new generation of criminals would emerge, less visible, less theatrical, perhaps more dangerous in their anonymity. The world of Charlie and Eddie Richardson, where everyone knew who ran what and where the boundaries were, where crime lords held court in pubs and everyone knew the rules. That world was dying. What remains is the legend, the stories, the warnings. When old-timers in South London pubs talk about the old days, they still lower their voices when the Richardson name comes up. Not out of respect, but out of habit, old habits from a time when saying the wrong thing about the wrong people could have serious consequences. Prison changes a man, not always in the ways you'd expect. Sometimes it doesn't break them, sometimes it reveals who they really are when everything else is stripped away. For Charlie and Eddie Richardson, the decades that followed their convictions would show two very different paths, two brothers who once ruled South London's underworld but couldn't even maintain loyalty to each other when the empire crumbled. Charlie Richardson sat in his cell in 1967 facing 25 years. 25 years, let that sink in, a quarter of a century. Men had been born, grown up, had families, and died in the time he was meant to serve. The judge hadn't just sentenced him to prison, he'd sentenced him to miss an entire generation of life. The swinging 60s were ending, and Charlie would miss the 70s, the 80s, maybe even the 90s. The world he knew was disappearing, and he'd be watching it change through prison bars. But Charlie wasn't the type to accept defeat. Even in prison, he was thinking, planning, looking for angles. In 1980, after 13 years inside, after countless appeals and attempts to obtain release, Charlie Richardson did something that shocked even those who knew him well. He escaped from an open prison. Open prisons are meant for prisoners who are trusted, who are close to release, who have shown they can be rehabilitated. Charlie threw that trust back in their faces. He went on the trot for almost a year, even dressing as Santa Claus and giving out presents to children to publicize his requests for release. Think about that image for a moment. One of Britain's most notorious gangsters, a man who'd been convicted in the torture trial, dressed as Father Christmas, handing out presents to children. There's something desperately sad about it, almost tragically comic. Here was a man who'd once commanded fear across South London, reduced to a publicity stunt in a red suit and fake beard. The authorities weren't amused. Charlie's freedom couldn't last. He was eventually arrested in Earl's Court on suspicion of possession of drugs, having just been seen coming out of a sex shop, which was known to be controlled by the Richardson family. His identity only came to light once arrested and in police custody in Kensington, when his probation officer contacted the police, having been informed by other gang members that he had been arrested. Charlie Richardson was not freed until July 1984. 17 years. 17 years of his life spent behind bars, watching the world change through newspapers and prison televisions, hearing about life on the outside through visitors who aged with each visit while he stayed trapped in the same place, the same routine, the same four walls. Eddie's journey was different but no less tragic. Released earlier than Charlie, you might think he'd learned his lesson. You might think that after seeing what prison did to a man, after losing years of his life, he'd go straight. But the pull of the old life, the only life he really knew, was too strong. In 1990, Eddie Richardson was sentenced to 35 years after being convicted of involvement in a £70 million cocaine and cannabis heist. Imagine being in your 50s, having already served years in prison, and facing another 35 years. Eddie would be an old man by the time he got out, if he lived that long. He was originally sentenced to 35 years but was released after 12, bringing his total number of years served to 23 years, nearly a quarter century of his life spent in prison. But something remarkable happened to Eddie in prison. Eddie learnt to paint in prison and has become a critically acclaimed painter and now produces artwork both commissioned and of his own volition. In the confined space of a cell, with nothing but time, Eddie discovered he could create beauty. The hands that had once been instruments of violence now held brushes, creating art that people would actually pay money for. There's redemption in that transformation, the idea that even someone who'd been part of such darkness could find something creative, something positive. The relationship between the brothers, however, deteriorated beyond repair. The brothers fell out badly after Eddie accused Charlie of fraudulent business deals during Eddie's time in prison. Think about that. After everything they'd been through together, after building an empire based on loyalty and family, they couldn't even trust each other. The very foundation of their power, the unbreakable bond between brothers, had crumbled. Charlie Richardson died of peritonitis in September 2012. A heavy smoker, he had suffered from emphysema for several years. He was 78 years old. The funeral was held at New Camberwell Cemetery on October 9, 2012, and it was everything you'd expect from a gangland farewell. The old faces showed up, men in their 70s and 80s who'd once been part of that world, paying their respects to a man who'd been both feared and, in his own way, respected. The ashes of Frankie Fraser are also scattered nearby. Mad Frankie, who'd been their enforcer, their weapon, scattered near his old boss. Even in death, the gang stayed together in a way they never could in life. Eddie Richardson lived on, a survivor in every sense of the word. Eddie also lectures about his former life and has become a popular after-dinner speaker. Imagine that, paying £300 to have lunch with Eddie Richardson, to hear stories from a man who'd been part of the torture gang. There's something deeply uncomfortable about it, this commercialization of criminality, this transformation of violence into entertainment. In his later years, Eddie has been remarkably candid about his past and his feelings about the craze. Eddie Richardson describes Ronnie and Reggie Cray as small-time fantasists who played at being gangsters, saying they were not in our league. They were small-timers who just loved playing up to their image of being gangsters. They were not hard enough to take us on until we were all banged up. There's bitterness there even after all these years. The rivalry that defined an era of London's criminal history still burns in an old man's memory. Eddie said the Crays had watched too many American gangster films. They wanted to be like Al Capone, but they didn't have the brains to do anything major league. But Eddie's reflections go deeper than just old rivalries. Eddie Richardson spends his time hiring himself out as a £300 lunch date, during which he would tell stories about his time as a leading gangster. He has admitted that he wouldn't want to meet myself now as I was then. That admission that he wouldn't want to meet his younger self tells you everything about the journey he's been on. The young Eddie Richardson was someone to fear. The old Eddie Richardson is someone who fears what he used to be. The tragedy of the Richardson story isn't just the violence or the wasted years in prison. It's the human cost that ripples out from their actions. Every person they hurt had a family. Every business they destroyed represented someone's dreams. Every young man who looked up to them and followed in their footsteps perpetuated a cycle of violence and crime that destroyed communities. Think about their sister Elaine, born in 1940, who had to grow up with the Richardson name, who had to live with what her brothers had become. Think about their mother, who ran a sweet shop, who tried to raise her children right after their father abandoned them, who had to watch her sons become everything she'd tried to protect them from. Think about the victims who never fully recovered, who spent the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, who couldn't sleep without checking the locks one more time. The Richardson gang's methods were extreme even by criminal standards. The stories that emerged during the torture trial shocked a nation that thought it had seen everything during the war years. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation, they were calculated acts of brutality designed to send a message. And the message was simple: cross the Richardsons and you'll suffer in ways you can't imagine. Yet looking back now, what strikes you most is how small their world really was. They thought they were kings, but they ruled over a few neighborhoods in South London. They thought they were untouchable, but they were brought down by their own violence, their own inability to see that the world was changing around them. The police might have been corrupt in the 60s, but that corruption couldn't last forever. The wall of silence that protected them was always going to crack eventually. Former Detective Superintendent John Cummings said, "You had the Crays and the Richardsons, but I think the Richardsons were more violent than the Crays." The Richardsons were frighteners, really vicious people. When a police officer who's seen everything says you're really vicious, that means something. These weren't Robin Hood figures, stealing from the rich to give to the poor. These were predators who fed on fear. The London they knew has completely disappeared. Camberwell, where they grew up, has been gentrified. The pubs where they conducted business have been converted into gastropubs or luxury flats. The scrap yards they operated have been cleared for development. You can walk the streets where they once ruled and find no trace of their empire. It's as if the city itself has chosen to forget, to pave over the past and pretend it never happened. But the lessons of the Richardson story remain relevant. They show us what happens when violence becomes business, when fear becomes currency, when family loyalty becomes twisted into something dark and destructive. They remind us that no empire built on fear can last forever, that violence ultimately consumes those who live by it. Today, Eddie Richardson is in his late 80s, one of the last surviving links to that era. His brother Charlie has been dead for over a decade. Mad Frankie Fraser is gone, the Cray twins are gone. the world they inhabited, where everyone knew who ran what and violence was public and theatrical, that world is extinct. Modern criminals operate differently, less visibly, more internationally, using technology instead of pliers. Eddie once said, "My mind was always on the outside while I was inside. I wanted to expand my horizons. I started painting and realized I was good at it." In those words, you can hear both regret and a kind of pride. He found something meaningful even in the worst circumstances. He discovered he could create rather than destroy. But he also said something else about prison that's deeply revealing. Speaking about Reggie Cray, Eddie said, "But Reggie just immersed himself in prison culture and didn't look beyond four walls. That was it for him. They didn't make use of their time, and it was like they gave up on life." Eddie saw prison as something to survive and overcome. Others saw it as the end of everything. The cost of the Richardson brothers' crimes can't be measured just in years served or violence inflicted. It's measured in the fear that lingered in South London for years after they were imprisoned. It's measured in the young men who saw them as role models and followed them into crime. It's measured in the corruption they spread through the police force, the businesses they destroyed, the communities they terrorized. There's a photograph from Charlie's funeral in 2012 that captures something essential about the end of this story. Old men in dark suits, some using walking sticks, gathered around a grave. These were the survivors of that era, the ones who'd made it through the violence, the prison sentences, the changing world. They looked ordinary, like somebody's grandfather, like men you might see feeding pigeons in the park. But these were men who'd once made London tremble. Long gone are the days of the Richardson gang's reign of terror, which are now but a footnote in the criminal underworld. A footnote, that's what it all comes down to. All that violence, all that fear, all those wasted years, reduced to a footnote in history. The Richardson brothers wanted to be remembered, wanted to matter, wanted to leave their mark on the world. And they did, but not in the way they intended. They're remembered as a cautionary tale, as an example of what happens when intelligence and ambition are channeled into darkness. They're remembered for the fear they created, not the respect they craved. They're remembered as men who had everything they needed to succeed legitimately, but chose another path, a path that led to decades in prison, broken relationships, and ultimately, lonely deaths. Charlie died at 78, his body ravaged by emphysema, his empire long since crumbled. The man who'd once run South London's underworld died of peritonitis, an inflammation of the tissue that lines the inner wall of the abdomen. There's no glory in that death, no dramatic ending, just an old man's body finally giving up after years of damage. Eddie survived longer, but survival isn't the same as living. 23 years in prison. 23 years of watching life happen through bars, of eating prison food, of counting days that all looked the same. When he finally got out, the world had changed so much he might as well have traveled to another planet. The London he knew was gone, the people he knew were dead or scattered. The only thing that remained was his reputation, and even that had become something to sell, to package for after-dinner speeches. Eddie said about a potential film, "I am only willing to be involved in any film on the grounds that it tells the truth about either my life or events from it. My 2005 book, The Last Word, is a true account of my life. Any film made about me should not contradict my book, and if it does, then it becomes fiction in my mind. I would not want people who bought my book to see years later that I put my name to something that tells a completely different story. My life has been full of real events that would make many so-called gangster films look tame, so I see no good reason to fictionalize it." Even now in his 80s, Eddie wants to control the narrative, wants to ensure his version of events is the one that's remembered. But history doesn't belong to any one person. The Richardson story belongs to everyone they affected, the victims, the police who finally caught them, the communities that suffered under their rule, the families torn apart by their violence. What makes the Richardson story particularly tragic is that it didn't have to happen this way. Charlie and Eddie were intelligent, hardworking, creative men. Charlie had genuine business acumen. Eddie discovered he had artistic talent. They could have channeled those abilities into legitimate success. Instead, they chose violence, and violence chose them in return. The final truth about the Richardson brothers is this. They thought they were writing their own story, but they were really just playing out an ancient tragedy. The rise and fall of violent men who mistake fear for respect, who build empires on foundations of sand, who discover too late that everything they've built can be destroyed in a single police raid, a single trial, a single moment when the fear they've created turns to courage in their victims. In the end, Charlie and Eddie Richardson weren't larger-than-life figures. They weren't criminal masterminds or anti-establishment heroes. They were two boys from Camberwell who lost their way, who let abandonment and poverty twist them into something monstrous, who spent their lives trying to prove they mattered through violence and fear. They succeeded only in proving that violence consumes everything it touches, including those who wield it. Today, when old-timers in South London pubs tell stories about the Richardsons, they lower their voices not out of fear anymore, but out of habit. Out of memory of a time when saying the wrong thing about the wrong people could cost you everything. That's the Richardson legacy, not empire, not wealth, not even respect. Just the fading memory of fear, growing quieter with each passing year, until eventually, even the memory will be gone. The true tragedy is that somewhere in South London right now, there's probably a young man who thinks he's different, who thinks he can build an empire on violence and not be consumed by it. He's heard the stories about the Richardsons, about the craze, about the old days when gangsters were gangsters. He thinks those are stories of glory, not warnings. He doesn't understand that Charlie Richardson died gasping for breath, his empire long since turned to dust. He doesn't understand that Eddie Richardson spent 23 years staring at prison walls, discovering too late that he could create art instead of chaos. The Richardson brothers wanted to be remembered. They succeeded. But being remembered isn't the same as being mourned. Being feared isn't the same as being respected. Building an empire isn't meaningful if it crumbles the moment you're arrested. They're remembered now as a cautionary tale, as proof that no matter how feared you are, no matter how much power you accumulate through violence, it all ends the same way, with old men in prison cells, wondering where the years went, wondering if any of it was worth it. It wasn't, it never is. The streets of South London are quiet now, or at least quiet in a different way. The Richardson name doesn't inspire fear anymore. It's just history, just another story from a London that no longer exists. Charlie is buried in Camberwell, the place where it all began. Eddie continues on, one of the last witnesses to an era that seems more like mythology than history with each passing year. But perhaps that's the most fitting end to the Richardson story, not a dramatic shootout, not a blaze of glory, but a slow fade into history, into cautionary tale, into a reminder that empires built on fear always fall, and when they fall, they take everyone with them. The Richardson brothers thought they were building something that would last forever. Instead, they built a monument to the futility of violence, a testament to wasted potential, a grave marker for dreams that turned to nightmares. And in the end, that's all that remains of the Richardson empire: memories, regrets, and the echo of fear that grows fainter with each passing year, until one day even the echo will be gone, and Charlie and Eddie Richardson will be nothing more than names in old newspaper archives, a footnote in the history of crime, a reminder of what happens when men choose darkness over light, violence over peace, fear over love. The story ends not with a bang, but with a whisper, the whisper of old men remembering their youth, of victims finally able to sleep without fear, of a city that's moved on and left the Richardsons behind. It ends with Eddie Richardson, in his late 80s, one of the last living links to that violent era, selling his stories for £300 a lunch, painting pictures in the studio he never could have imagined when he was young and violent and thought the world belonged to him and his brother. It ends with the truth that every empire built on violence learns too late, that fear is temporary, that violence consumes its practitioners, that in the end all that remains is regret and the terrible knowledge that it could have been different, should have been different, but now it's too late to change anything except the warning you leave behind for those who come after. The Richardson brothers are that warning now, not heroes, not legends, not even villains anymore, just a warning, fading but still present, that the path they chose leads nowhere worth going. That's their legacy, that's their story. That's the truth about Charlie and Eddie Richardson, London's most feared gangsters who discovered too late that fear is a prison you build for yourself, and once you're inside, there's no escape.